Welcome everyone here tonight. My name's Rita Brown and I'm the President of the Australian BPD Foundation, and the Foundation each year coordinates activities and events around BPD Awareness Week. So we're really honoured tonight to have three presenters from New South Wales presenting for us from an organisation called Alt2Su, or Alternatives to Suicide, which is very much a peer space for people experiencing suicidal distress. Before I go any further, I would like to ask Marley to do an acknowledgement of country for us, please.
Thanks, Rita. I want to acknowledge today that I am here on the stolen lands of the Wangal people. And I also want to acknowledge that when we come together in online spaces, we're coming together often across an entire continent that has over 200 Aboriginal nations, which includes within those nations different countries and lands, which means that we're coming across multiple different cultural groups, language groups, and ways of understanding of being across this continent. And all of those things matter and they're important and they shape who and how we are in the world. So I want to acknowledge all of the nations, countries, and lands that you're joining us on this evening. I hope that you've had some time to interact with the country that you're on today, knowing that that can provide us some mental health support that is free, hopefully accessible, and has wonderful healing effects on our bodies. So I extend all of my love, thanks, gratitude, and I guess, yeah, just deep thanks to all of the people that have held this country over the last 80,000 years, the oldest living culture on the face of the planet. And I especially would like to just send some love up to the Wiradjuri people, who are my grandfather's people. And if you'd like to do so, it's up to you. Feel free to let us know what country, lands that you're joining us on today in the chat. So pop that in as a way of acknowledging where you're landing today and where you're joining us from. But yeah, thank you for being here and being on this country with us. Oh, people from other continents are popped up in Singapore. Wonderful, amazing. Much respect to the First Nations communities around the world that may be joining us as well.
Definitely. So just a very quick introduction to the Australian BPD Foundation. And why isn't my slide changing? Sorry, I might just have to stop the share. So the Australian BPD Foundation was formed in 2013 as a peak body representing people with BPD and their carers, supporters, family, kin, and also clinicians, aiming to get developing an open dialogue between all the different people that are impacted by BPD in one way or another, and to encourage a positive culture around this mental illness that's currently known as borderline personality disorder. We're registered as a charity by the ACNC and all donations are tax deductible. BPD Awareness Week is the first week in October, and we're having a number of events in a couple online and also in a number of the different states. So the message for this year's BPD Awareness Week is BPD, see the person. It reminds us to look beyond the person as the label or the diagnosis they might have, ask what their experiences are and how they continue to make sense of the world. So it's very much about let's celebrate the person that they are alongside their diagnosis, acknowledging their strengths, resilience and courage in order to see the person. So we've got a purpose-built website where we make available all our resources. Marley is the graphic designer who does all the graphics for our resources, and I'd like to acknowledge Marley's fantastic contribution in this. You're welcome to download the resources and just use them for private use, we certainly ask that you don't edit them, and if you use them elsewhere, to acknowledge the source. So it's great to see people attending from around Australia. Thanks for that, Marley. And also I saw somebody from Singapore, so that's also great. We encourage you to use any skills and strategies that might be available to support you tonight in distress. Marley will be doing a trauma-informed check-in in a moment. And as well, Marley is available if you feel like you would like to have a one-on-one chat with somebody. So just send her or me a message via chat and we can organise a breakout room for you. So if you've got any questions, if you just put them in the chat, that would be fantastic, and I'll try and assimilate those questions and pose them. We'll have a couple of question and answer sessions available throughout the session. So we'll try and coordinate those questions. So Marley, I'd like to hand over to you for your tip skills or your tip check-in.
Thanks, Rita. So I just want to acknowledge that obviously we've come into this space and we know that we might be talking about some things that might activate some stuff for a lot of people here this evening. So we're going to be talking about some of the experiences of suicide and what that might look or feel like. And so just a reminder to check in where you're at, to check in what's going on with your body and to be responsive to that. It's important for us to respond with kindness and compassion to the activations that might happen within our body. And you've got skills and strategies to survive those things. They're inherent to you. Your brain has probably learned how to cope with those things before, and it is incredibly skilled at doing that. It loves to protect us. That's its main driver. So let's lean into those things. So what works for you is what works for you. And so we encourage you to use that in the space. So for me, one of the things that happens is that when I'm under a lot of stress or when people are talking about things that might be upsetting, I get really cold. I don't know why, but my temperature drops. So I have a weighted heated blanket and I've got it with me. So I never come into a session without that. One of the things I also do is I like to draw to regulate my emotion and to be able to listen better and focus. So I've got a Zentangle I started working on last night, and I'm going to probably be doing that as we go. So I encourage you to adjust your environment in whatever way you need this evening to bring those things into your space. So take a few minutes to land in our space and see if you need to run around, and maybe you need to grab an essential oil. You need to get a cat or a dog and bring them a little bit closer to you if they're your regulator, or if you need to get a pen and some paper or a cup of tea or something like that. So just think about how you land in your space. And as Rita has said, I'll be around if you need to have a chat with somebody one-on-one. You can send me a private message through the chat and we can do that and just be checking in with each other. I will prompt you to use your skills and strategies though, because I know you have them. And so I'm not here to kind of direct you to any type of crisis service, although if that works, then go ahead and do that. But I'm going to do my best to kind of check in with you about what you know works and whether or not we can encourage you to get access to that. But hopefully we'll all be able to come together and have a good conversation about a really important topic this evening. But check in if you need to. Thanks a lot. Yeah, so one thing that I use with people that I run groups with is we have this little sheet that we designed called My Trauma Informed Space Checklist. And it's just simply a place where we write down some of the strategies that we've got, because sometimes our survival brain can't remember those things. So this is a really good thing to kind of put in place before that distress kicks in and the survival brain does what it does. So I would probably put down some of the things. So for physical activations, like for example, getting really cold, I just put down a prompt for myself, go and get your blanket. Where is your blanket? Or if it was an emotional activation, I'd put in, have you tried doing a Zentangle or a repetitive line drawing? And so all of that is just a way of creating a bit of a cope ahead plan, because I know that when I'm in distress, my survival brain is doing the best she can with what she's got, and she can't remember some of those things, and that's not her fault. So it's about trying to get her as prepped as we possibly can. So you've got that sent to you. So you might want to take a few moments to jot some things down if that works for you. Up to you. Thanks, Rita.
Thanks, Marley. Now I'd like to hand over to Scarlett, Catherine and Emma from Alt2Su to introduce themselves and to introduce the organisation that they're representing tonight. And I guess the strategies and the thought processes that are happening around how that organisation works, because I must admit that I really know very little about it. I'm interested to know.
Hi, everyone. Good evening, or I'm not sure what time it is in Singapore, but thanks for joining us. My name's Scarlett, and I can't speak to any particular organisation, but I've been working with the University of Sydney since 2018 as a lived experience researcher, sometimes called survivor researcher or peer researcher. And I also carry a living experience of carrying a borderline diagnosis. And I hope that everyone here can appreciate that means a lot of attendant experiences of abuse and adversity and oppression and injustice that undergird that. And I also love and know and love many people that carry that borderline diagnosis. And so I'm really thrilled to be here in this great company tonight and appreciate all the work of these incredible volunteers. What Emma and Kath and I are here tonight to share with you all about a little bit is something called Alternatives to Suicide, which we in New South Wales have shortened to Alt2Su. That's just how it came about in groups. But in other states in Australia, people call it different things. So if you hear Alt2Su, that's just the abbreviation that arose organically in our groups.
So just following on from Scarlett's introduction a little bit earlier, my name's Kath. I'm the co-founder and co-lead of a very small organisation called Inside Out and Associates. We create spaces for conversations that bring alternative perspectives around experiences of distress, extreme states, and complex feelings. And we do a lot of work kind of promoting, I guess, alternatives to traditional approaches, especially ones that are lived experience led, driven, founded, researched, and that's hence the Inside Out. So that's where we're coming from, and we're actually at the moment the home of Alt2Su in New South Wales. I guess we have been very fortunate in the past to do work with folk from Off the Wall, who actually were the first, set up the first Alternatives to Suicide group. And then we went on to work with them, and then since that time ended up taking on, I guess, just holding the space to make sure that we had Alternatives to Suicide available in New South Wales. And we've been working with some of the other states as well that have also been establishing Alternatives to Suicide. So that's just a little bit about me, and I'm going to hand over to Emma.
Thank you. It's so lovely to be here tonight. I'm here because I was really lucky to be part of a research team that really looked at what it's like to attend and be part of Alternatives to Suicide groups. And that was part of my role at the University of Sydney. So we looked at the experiences of attending and the impacts of attending, and we're really pleased to share some of the findings tonight. I think the findings are really profound and exciting and hopeful, around what's possible in a non-clinical peer-led space. So thank you.
Thanks, Emma. Thanks, Kath. And thank you, Gillian, for what you shared and the work you're doing, and to all the volunteers who've put this together.
Sometimes I know I like to sometimes know what's ahead of me. And so what we thought that we would do is share a little bit about, first of all, the approach. And so what this means, this thing that we keep referring to, alternatives to suicide. And we've said a little bit about that. And then there'll be some space for questions. And then we'll also talk a bit to the actual research, and then there'll be more opportunities for questions. And we'll obviously keep an eye on the chat throughout.
Thanks, everyone. I guess I just wanted to begin by just returning to what I was saying about myself being someone that carries this diagnosis, and that I also have lived experience with suicide attempts, and also with coercive and other mainstream responses to suicide. So I've been attending alternatives to suicide groups since 2018 and facilitating them since early last year, which has been my great pleasure. And like Kath said, what I'd like to do is just invite everyone to ask questions, any questions they may have in the chat. You can also raise your hand to ask questions during the Q&A, but just keep in mind that this is being recorded to be shared in a little while. Point for us. I might just say that the origin story of alternatives to suicide as an approach is really fascinating. It began in the United States with the Western Massachusetts Recovery Learning Community, which has since been rebranded as the Wildflower Alliance. And it began as this kind of response to some of the limitations of these kind of risk management, diagnosis-oriented ways of approaching things. And so it's deliberately non-clinical and peer-to-peer mutual support. And I'd love to tell you more about the story about how it came to Australia, because it's wonderful. But you can actually read about that on the New South Wales Alternatives to Suicide website, which will be part of the information we provide with the beautiful postcard that Marley designed for us. And I'm going to just try and explain a little bit about what alternatives to suicide groups are. But with that being said, I think when we come to the research project, the findings of the research actually go really far to elucidating what Alt2Su is all about, because it's in people's own words. But I've got a little quote here from one of our research participants. Community, a sense of belonging, a sense of connection, purpose, love. I think often that's the antidote to distress. And this particular participant was talking about the way that the connections they make in these groups help to change one's relationship to suicidal feelings and thoughts, and help people shed shame. So the groups are offered with no referral or diagnosis, no risk assessments are conducted. Everyone over 18 is welcome, and there's no sort of there are no actions taken to escalate intervention if somebody seems unwell or at risk. So there's no people can feel comfortable that they can speak openly about suicide without having the local mental health service called on them, or the police, or anything like that. And this is in line with the values of alternatives to suicide that are set out in the charter. So the charter is one of the key documents in the big old facilitator handbook. That's one of your take-home gifts when you do your training. And the values are all about the following things. So we have a focus on, wait for it, responsibility to, rather than responsibility for or over. So rather than responsibility for keeping others alive, we focus on a responsibility to one another, to sitting
with one another through dark times. This is part of the value of consent and self-determination. So we see suicidal experiences in Alt2Su as valid responses to adverse experiences in life, to trauma and injustice. Thanks so much for the values of Alt2Su. Another one is responses to injustice. So, you know, Alt2Su really we aim to validate and explore the pain and the painful consequences that come from experiences of oppression, whether they be in the interpersonal or the institutional domain, that often, you know, undergird people, the reasons, the experiences that people find themselves, you know, in coming to the attention of all the various services that Gillian was speaking of, when they're struggling with suicidal thoughts and feelings. Another value is healing in communities. So we have an emphasis on vulnerability and mutual connection. And I think we'll move on to the next slide. Thank you. And I just wanted to give a quick idea of what these groups feel like, because I attended them for many years before I began to facilitate them. And so I'm just going to give you a little insight to this recipe for connection. So something really beautiful about Alt2Su that many of our participants commented upon was that unlike many other group therapies or other peer-to-peer mutual supports, there is a culture that creates this supportive space, but there's not a formula. There's not a manualized approach to recovery. We don't have this idea of a linear direction. We don't have any agenda to try and move people through distress or to shut them down. We're not anxiously shoving tissues in people's faces when they cry because we're uncomfortable about our own discomfort with their emotions. Instead, we try to see and hear each other and feel connected. And so the formula that the founders of Alt2Su came up with, formula for want of a better word, is VCVC, which is validation, curiosity, vulnerability, and community. And I'd like to have more time to go into some examples of these, but I think what you can take away today is that this is all about fostering connection, because, you know, Alt2Su is looking at suicide in a different way. Instead of saying, why does someone want to die and how can we prevent them from dying? Instead, we're saying, why is it that someone's life has come to such a state where they don't want to live? And how can we support them to cultivate a life that's worth living for them? So thanks very much. We'll have a little Q&A now. And I also want to let everyone know that we have a brilliant community forum that was filmed and recorded in 2018 with some of the American trainers that's available on our website as well. If you wouldn't mind, you can pop to the next slide if you don't mind, Marley. Thanks for your help. Yeah, so if you want to use the raise your hand function, it's down in reactions. I'd be very happy to take people's live questions. If not, I think it's Kath's turn to present some of the questions that came through in the chat, if any.
I haven't seen any questions yet, Scarlett, in the chat. Although somebody has said, I love the approach and values, thank you for sharing. And also comments on your presentation, Scarlett.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I have a question for you.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
I think reflecting on what my fears about first joining an Alt2Su group as a participant was, I was really worried. Of course, I thought that someone was going to call acute care services, and it took weeks of that not happening before I was settled, because that was always the response. But one of the things that I was really worried about going in was whether or not I was going to have my camera on on the online groups, whether or not I'm asked to use my voice, to use my my legal name, things like that, about the level of interaction as well. I wonder if you could speak to that.
Absolutely. Those are fantastic questions. So for people that aren't aware, my experience of attending Alt2Su groups is that from 2018 in New South Wales, they were in person. So you didn't need to use your real name, and you didn't need to tell anybody anything about yourself, and you're welcome to wear a balaclava if you'd like to, frankly. But you know, the energy created in the space came at the cost of, you know, people were going to see you and hear your voice. However, since COVID, we've been doing the groups online, and that's come with its pros and cons, and our research participants spoke about that. But one of the benefits of it is that people can use a pseudonym, and they can actually leave their camera off the entire time if they like. They can choose to just listen. Many people who attend regularly will attend at all times in their life. So there will be times where they want to chime in and they have a lot to say. And then there'll be other times where they'll just let the group know that they don't feel like speaking. And I think something I should also just emphasize as well on your question, Marley, is that one of the principles in Alt2Su is that the facilitators are participants too. And so facilitators, you know, are there to kind of help create this atmosphere that we want to build. But the facilitators have the opportunity to come and be supported by the group as well, in whatever state they're in. Thank you.
There's a few more questions now in the chat. What does a typical session look like? And have many people been accessing the groups?
Great, thanks, Emma. We keep a record of how many people have been accessing the groups, and I would say the average is 8. I've been in for the online groups anyway. I've been in and facilitated groups with as many as 17 people, I think, at most, but I would say it's usually like 10 people that are attending. And there's always the option, if many people show up in person or online, that we can actually do breakout rooms, whether physically or whether online, you know, to just kind of keep that atmosphere. As for the other question, what does a group look like? We have a little opening ritual. There's no specific kind of prayer or statement that needs to be said, but we tend to kind of share a little something about the values of the group. And that could be done by a facilitator, but it could also be done by a participant who's been attending for a long time and who cares to chime in and kind of say something about what Alt2Su means for them and what it's about. And the purpose of that is to not assume that everybody, you know, has attended the group before, but also not necessarily to ask them and out them as new members of the group, and to just make people comfortable with what to expect. After that, I can't really give you a whole lot of information except to point you to the outcomes of our forthcoming research and the other research that we're building on, because the conversation can be about any topic. This is the thing, when we're allowed to speak about suicidal thoughts and feelings, and we expand this lens from what's wrong with me to what's happening to me, from what I want to stop to what I actually need, then, you know, our conversations, you know, sometimes we'll have fantastic conversations about people's spiritual and creative pursuits. Sometimes we'll have very challenging conversations about people's abuse histories. But the focus of the group is relationship. So yeah, it's really about just connecting and being curious and authentic in the moment. Are there any more questions, Emma?
There was a question about access and how to access the groups. There is another question, can people attend infrequently? And
Sure.
and another question around, are the groups focused on a particular disorder or is it diverse?
Sure, thanks. I can answer those questions. So people can attend the groups whenever and for however long as they like. So we interviewed someone in our research who had attended one group and found it really helpful, but had other life things and hasn't attended since. And then we interviewed some people who've been attending for 3 years. Most people attend I was going to say semi-regularly, but that's the same as semi-inconsistently. I think there are a lot of people that have attended for a couple of years, but that will attend 6 out of 10 groups. The great thing about Alt2Su is that the more groups we can offer, the more that people are free to attend, because you're free to attend as many as you like, at least, that are accessible to you when they're on Zoom. So we had comments from people in our research who said, knowing that there was an Alt2Su group available for me 4 nights a week was so helpful, because if on Sunday night I wasn't feeling so good, I knew I was going to have people to talk to on Monday and Tuesday and Thursday, etc. In answer to, I'm just trying to recall the other questions. In answer to the question about other groups focused on a particular disorder, I think this is where I really should have said a little more about the philosophy of alternatives to suicide, but thanks for giving me the opportunity to do that. So there's no formal process for joining an alternatives to suicide group. You simply show up. That's the case whether it's in person or whether it's on Zoom. So whether you would like to share what labels you might be carrying or have received or are exploring or not is completely up to you. Oftentimes people will share those things by way of shorthand to kind of explain their background or to try and make connections with others. But the focus of alternatives to suicide is on humanizing and normalizing experiences of suicidal thoughts and feelings. So we're much more focused on how are you feeling and how long have you been feeling that way, and what's your story around it? What does it mean to you? So I guess I'm saying that, like I said, anything that someone wants to discuss can be discussed. And that includes, their perspective on any diagnoses they carry, but it's not a focus of the group. And there's certainly no gatekeeping in terms of you must have a particular diagnosis. Thanks for that question.
I can't see any further questions for now.
All right. Well, if you think of any further questions about these things, everybody, you can keep putting them in the chat. And now I'm going to share a little bit more. Well, I'm going to share a little bit about the research that we've been doing. So Marley, if you wouldn't mind just heading to the next slide. So I'm not going to have time to do this entire thing justice. I think in the end, our report was something like 16,000 words long. We really wanted to present a robust reflection of the stories that were shared with us. But what I can say is that the project was all about, exploring the experiences of 19 people that have attended Alt2Su groups in New South Wales. So I'll start with a little headlines of the findings. So Marley, if you wouldn't mind heading to the next slide. So the first finding was about Alt2Su groups providing a safe space to share and explore. So we've got the quotes in bold here are from participants from our research. So a lot of people we spoke to talked about how the environment being free of intervention and coercion, free of diagnostic gatekeeping, free of compulsory psychiatric intervention, and the pressure to follow some kind of manual for recovery is what allowed them, in many cases, for the first time, to really be heard, to really be witnessed in what was going on for them. Yeah, so that was a consensus in all participants. Next slide, please, Marley. Sorry, I feel bad conducting you like that.
Don't. Just next slide. That's all you need to do.
Next slide. I'm going to have like a... Thank you. So our next finding was about social contexts and meanings. You know, people told us that in many cases, for the first time, alternatives to suicide groups were a place where the contexts, the contributors around their suicidal thoughts and feelings could be seen and heard about and explored for the first time. We had many participants who said things to us like, you know, in all my interactions with hospital, in all my help seeking and attending, you know, psychiatric appointments, no one ever asked me why I was feeling suicidal. No one was interested in my grief, or if I shared about, you know, my loss or trauma or discrimination I was going through. This itself was used to justify treatments that I didn't necessarily want to take part in. And so, you know, through having the space and the opportunity to for people to politicize their distress and connect it with, you know, both their interpersonal experiences and sort of broader social injustices, it creates this space where people can encounter new meanings, make new meaning of their suicidal distress. So instead of, for example, people talked a lot about shame. So instead of, for example, their suicidal thoughts and actions meaning that there's something wrong with them, perhaps it means that, you know, they've been silenced, or, you know, that their resilience has been misconstrued. For, you know, for example, the ways they may have coped with terrible things that people, like Gillian was saying, that we just don't want to know about, so we want to put them over here in a corner, you know, may have been, you know, responded to in unhelpful ways. Next slide, please. And that really leads into our third finding, which was about a new relationship with distress. You know, people talked about finding new ways of thinking about and connecting with and exploring their suicidal thoughts and feelings, and that they learned from each other, and that doing this reduced their fear around their suicidal thoughts and feelings. And in helping them shed that shame, it really helped increase people's capacity to respond with curiosity and self-compassion to their own experiences. I think something really beautiful that happens in the groups is that the curiosity and compassion that we receive from others, we can internalize and then offer to ourselves. And the key to this is the fact that the space offers the opportunity for these conversations to put distress in a broader context that maybe we haven't been offered before. So that's, as our participants told us, you know, connecting their experiences of suicide to their personal histories and circumstances. You know, people found that learning new ways of approaching their feelings meant, in some cases, you know, they were empowered to handle them in new and different ways, but also just that, you know, having them wasn't necessarily a cause for panic. Thank you. Next slide, please. So our next finding was about harmful experiences in mainstream mental health services. These were described by all participants, and almost all participants described, you know, avoiding contact with the psychiatric system and other mainstream health systems. You know, sometimes this was at great personal risk in the absence of other alternatives. You know, people described that the focus on risk aversion in mainstream mental health services meant that many people found themselves in this horrible paradox that I think many people here will be able to relate to. It's the paradox of needing to appear unwell enough to be granted access to the service where you're trying to seek help, but not so unwell that you receive, you know, compulsory detention or seclusion or restraint, or actually being expelled from the service entirely. So something that Alt2Su groups were valued for was the orientation to risk that we take, where we're interested in sitting with one another's distress, but there's no responsibility to or for anyone's safety. So I really want to give an example of what that looks like in a group. For example, if someone comes to a group highly distressed, and, you know, others are reflecting that they're, you know, feeling concern for them, and they're asking curious questions and, you know, validating what they're sharing, it might be that another participant at the end of the group says, hey, I really resonate with what you're going through. And, you know, I was going through this a couple of years ago, and do you want to meet up for coffee later in the week or whatever? But there's no obligation of anyone to do that. And certainly, unless someone is, you know, in the process of harming another person in the group, which has never happened, we do not, you know, phone police or acute care services or anything like that. Instead, we do the kind of thing that Marley was talking about earlier this evening, which is we invite people to explore with us, with support, what works for them. And, you know, there's this co-regulation going on, I suppose, but most of all, this different and quite unique approach to risk means that A, people are able to actually express themselves and what they're feeling, and B, when they do, you know, people don't run for the hills. Instead, people stay with them. And in saying that, if someone comes into the group very distressed, or they express something that activates somebody else, we're all responsible for ourselves as well. And so it's perfectly fine to mute your audio or head out, you know, or just ask for a little break. Or we always have two co-facilitators. So you can say to one of them, could I just have a private word with you for a little bit? I need some individual support. And then they might come back into the group. So this was a really key finding, and yeah, looking forward to sharing more of it with you in the future. The next slide, please, Marley, is our final finding from the report, which is about healing in relationship. So I'd like to read this quote. It was the first time I'd shared about suicidal distress, actually, and I was really grateful that I was able to do that. It saved my life. So I think many people in this, in our company tonight might, you know, resonate with that experience of, as soon as many mainstream services hear that you're having suicidal thoughts or feelings, a certain protocol is enacted, and they might ask you whether you have plans or this or that. But as I've said, because the response in Alt2Su is just to simply sit with that, say how you're feeling about that in the moment, ask curious questions of the person, it means that perhaps for the first time, the person gets the chance to actually talk about it. And that's how connection and relationships and communities are formed. And a really key thing that people spoke about for this finding was about alleviating shame and isolation. You know, shame was described as both a key contributor to and a consequence of suicidal distress, creating this awful feedback loop, you know, where isolation and shame engenders suicidal thoughts and feelings and vice versa. But people found that, you know, the groups, the relationships forged in the group, you know, were really powerful in counteracting isolation and shame. And I will say that people juxtaposed their experiences in alternatives to suicide with some other kinds of groups they'd attended, where they felt that, you know, some of the rules that were put in place with the best of intentions to try to kind of create containment or safety were actually, unfortunately, had the result of being, I can't think of a euphemism, but paternalistic. So rules, for example, like nobody can be friends or nobody can contact one another, or certain topics are out of bounds. And people found that there was a great deal of freedom and empowerment within the sort of the structure of these groups. And there are always questions from people hearing about Alt2Su for the first time of, what do you do when someone goes too far or talks about something that's too much, and does that break down relationships? And I think that's the really special, magical thing about Alt2Su that's hard to describe here, but that our participants described, which was that, you know, the opportunity to, you know, speak openly and make, you know, connections with one another and bear witness to one another's experiences, you know, alleviates a lot of the kind of issues that that we try to protect against in the company of others that are going through these things. Thanks, Marley. Next slide, if you don't mind. So I'll just speak really briefly before question time about co-design. So I think I mentioned earlier that I'm a lived experience or peer researcher, and I just wanted to share that, you know, co-design principles were really important to us in this project. They were embedded at every stage of the project, from the conceptual framework, which was informed by MAD studies and critical mental health theory, which are two sort of areas of study that they privilege the expertise of the person going through something. And that informed both our design of the study and the analysis we conducted. From the very beginning, we employed people with a lived experience of suicide and a lived experience of attending Alt2Su to come together like a bit of a committee and participate in a number of workshops to actually tell us how they'd like the research to be done and to help us design the right kinds of questions. And then myself and my colleague Natalia are two people that have a living experience with suicide and lived experience as, I guess, participants and facilitators of Alt2Su. Natalia being one of the two incredible women that were the first to bring us Alt2Su in New South Wales. And so if you get the chance to read our report when it comes out, I think you might be really interested to hear more about how we tried, and it's always a work in progress because, you know, co-design is always evolving, but we put a lot of energy and emphasis into ensuring that this was truly a co-design project all the way through. Thanks, Marley. The next thing I want to talk about briefly is just the ethics considerations in this project. So, you know, we are really grateful to New South Wales Health and our allies there, and to the University of Sydney for, you know, making this possible. All universities, you know, operate on the international ethics guidelines for human research, which, you know, came about for a very good reason. But, you know, what they've created is this vulnerability model. And Emma shared with me this great quote that's talking about this dichotomy where legal theory has sought to characterize people as either autonomous or dependent, and if dependent, vulnerable. And it's this vulnerability model that was originally set up to redress research causing harm to people, good thing, which can sometimes, be a very challenging paradigm to work within that bars people from participating in research. And I think I'll leave it there, but I'll just say it's been a really interesting part of the journey for us that we do share about in the report for people that are interested. I just want to make sure there's time for questions. So if I'm not sure if anyone has their hand raised, but Marley, you're welcome to close the presentation. Thanks so much. Thanks for bearing with me through this. It looks like we might have quite a few questions. Would anybody like to ask their question live, or otherwise, Kath or Emma, will you be sharing the ones from the chat?
There's a lot in the chat, but there aren't any specific questions as such about the research. There are a couple of things that were more about being recorded and someone who's just arrived catching up. So yeah, so I can't see anything in here that is specific to the Alt2Su research at this stage.
Sure.
I noticed some questions about the brain imaging studies that Marley referred to in the chat. So there was a presentation last night, and as soon as possible we'll get that loaded online, and people will be able to view it.
Just because you mentioned co-regulation, Scarlett, and so I just wanted to provide a bit of a what is co-regulation, because I think that was a really important thing that that you mentioned. That's very, very very important, because we just did a study that showed that co-regulation, or the ability to regulate what's going on for ourselves through being in a space with others who are able to do that, we've seen that there's a big jump in the brains of people with BPD in the ability to do that. And so it's something that I know that the researchers that are looking at that are kind of going, this is an amazing thing, and how can we utilize that? How can we bring that into spaces to help people? And so I think that also goes to providing us even more evidence of how effective being in spaces with peers is, and that connection.
Yeah, thanks, Marley. It's so true. And I think actually there is now a question that's just come up as well, which is, when will the Alt2Su research report be available?
I don't think I'm well placed to answer that, I'm afraid. We have a research summary available on the website that we can share. But yeah, at the moment, it's all ready to go. We're just waiting on the go ahead from New South Wales Health. But what people can do is, if I share the Alt2Su New South Wales website, there's an option to sign up for the newsletter. And so when we publish the report, you'll get an email. Hopefully it's soon. We hope it's soon. We wish it was yesterday.
Yeah, I mean, it can take a little while, and that's unfortunately the way it is. And they're really trying to get that back to us and get it released as soon as possible. Yeah, Scarlett, I'll just put the Alt2Su. You've done it. Excellent. Is there any other? Oh, is there intent to carry on the Zoom groups?
The Zoom groups are ongoing. If you go to that website that I've shared, I believe we currently have 3 groups running on Zoom. And people do attend them from all over Australia. Well, many people attend them from interstate, the Zoom groups. I personally, I don't project manage the groups themselves, so I'm not sure what the next step is, but I can say there've been many occasions this year where members and facilitators have discussed, like, when might we have one in person again, but you know, things were so uncertain that hasn't happened yet. But I think that based on our research and also just the feedback of all the people in New South Wales and beyond attending these groups, we feel that as long as it's possible, as long as we're able, having a Zoom option is fantastic, preferably in addition to in-person groups, because the Zoom groups, you love them or loathe them, but they've got pros and cons, and in some ways they're more accessible to people. I can't speak to how that, you know, will go in the future in terms of funding and facilitation and all of that. I will say that one of the reasons we delayed returning to in-person groups early this year was because when all the last lot of New South Wales COVID lockdown restrictions sort of ended around Christmas time last year, we decided that it wasn't kind of in the principles of alternatives to suicide to have any gatekeeping whatsoever in holding a group in person. And so we wanted to wait and kind of make sure that if the in-person groups were offered, they could be offered without the need for people to show vaccine passports or whatever. And if people prefer that, or if that's important for their health, then the Zoom groups are a possibility. But for people who want to attend in person, we want to create as much accessibility and as little obstacles to that as possible, as little gatekeeping as possible. Is it only for those in Australia? I'm not sure. Kath, can you answer that question?
Yeah, I mean, I guess if someone finds the Zoom groups and turns up from another country, they're definitely welcome to be part of the group. I guess some of the barriers to that are the times that the groups run, and that there are just the 3 groups at the moment where our funding, our formal funding is complete, and so now we're just trying to promote the groups and look at alternative fundings to support Alt2Su to keep going in New South Wales. And so we did have 6 groups, but we were unable to sustain 6 groups. And I mean, I think there's a lot of co-working amongst the states that all have Alt2Su groups, and so we're kind of really, you know, people are kind of turning up at the ones that work for them. And so you could live in New South Wales and find a group in WA. There's a discharge that runs the groups in WA, particularly specialised in trans and gender diverse groups. So that's a particular area. We do have an LGBTIQA plus group that we're hoping to get started soon. So just keep an eye out on our website and maybe look at some of the other websites. I think Chloe has put together some information for people as well. So
yeah, I would also add to that what Kath has said, that one of the key implications of the research that Emma and Natalia and Chloe and I did was that we need to increase the access to these kinds of groups, and also to this sort of research, you know, to expand our understanding of it. And Gillian has a question. Sorry, Kath, go on.
I was just going to say, in terms of the funding, alternatives to suicide groups they're not expensive to run. We pay facilitators, but I would say that that's still a very semi-voluntary kind of role as well. And there's a lot of the costs of training people. You have to do training to become a facilitator. And then there's just some costs around coordination. So they're not kind of really expensive or anything to run, but there are some costs. It's not 100% voluntary. So yeah. And there is a question from Gillian. I'm curious how many of the Alt2Su groups are attended by men at Spectrum. Most of our clients are women.
I can only speak to my experiences, but in attending Alt2Su groups in New South Wales since 2018, most groups I have attended have been mostly men. And it's been fantastic. We do run a women's group on Wednesday night at the moment that we've just begun. But some of my friends from Alt2Su that have known the longest are men. And I think that's really interesting. And also when I did my training early in 2021, it was just mostly men, like 60% men in the training, and people coming from all over New South Wales. Most of them were regional Australians or regional New South Welsh men and women.
One thing
So
that
that's pretty exciting
as well, in case anybody has a question about this, as a person who identifies as queer, I have not experienced, maybe just lucky, but I've been in all 3 of the New South Wales groups. I've never experienced any issues with that. So even though we might not have at the moment a LGBTIQA+ focus group, I found the people within the groups to be really open. There's often conversations about pronouns, and that's kind of become pretty normalized, is that we come in and we talk about our pronouns as we land in the space. And so that was, I guess, that's just something to reflect on, that, perhaps I was a little worried about it when I hear the word men. I'm going to say that it causes an activation in me. And I've been really, really lovingly surprised by just how open things have been in that space. And whilst I know that it would be great for us to have an LGBTIQA+ group, and we should definitely have one, I've been very lucky with my experiences, and haven't found it much of a barrier, but that's me and my experience.
Yeah, I can certainly second that. I can second what you're saying, Marley, from my personal experience as a lesbian. I've been attending the groups, and I've always found that they're very welcoming and inclusive, and we try to practice pluralism in all forms, which means sometimes there are people in the groups that think differently about these things, but the key principle of the group is respect and mutuality. And we found in our research that participants commented on these practices that you're talking about, and said that, even if they weren't personally relevant or important to them, that things like, acknowledging what land we're on and our pronouns and things like that really help create this safety and this beautiful atmosphere for people.
Yeah. I just want to point out as well that although we've got the lovely Kath, Scarlett and Emma who are representing New South Wales here, we actually did reach out to all other Alt2Su groups across the country. And so whilst they were unable to be with us, ironically, because most of them are holding groups right now, and so couldn't actually come because they're in that space, they provided us with the promotional material that they wanted you to have access to. So we're going to send you that. So we're going to send you all the information about the groups running in Western Australia, South Australia, Queensland, and New South Wales. There is currently no group running in Victoria. So perhaps the Victorians in the space, hi Gillian, might think about how they might help support the Alt2Su movement to get a Victorian group running.
I actually know 4 Victorians that are in the process. They've done the training, 2 of them, and 4 of them that are interested in setting up the groups. And I'm happy to ask them if they're happy to be put in contact with anybody here. But what they have told me, my Victorian friends, colleagues, is that, accessing the training is one part, and then kind of accessing funding and any kind of ongoing support can be challenging. And that's part of kind of, the emphasis in Alt2Su on being independent from mainstream organizations, is that, we want funding, but we want to be careful about or thoughtful about where we, access that funding. And, what we don't want to have any strings attached, I guess is what I'm saying.
Sure. Definitely.
So that can be a challenge. And that's what the Victorian folks have told me is slowing them down at the moment. But there is interest. There's lots of interest.
Yeah, just hand us the money and go away. Pretty much, right? Let us do what we do and just hand the money over and go away. Thank you.
There was a question about accessibility and closed captioning, and I'm not sure of the answer to that.
Sure. I think something that we do in the groups that's part of these kind of rituals we offer to people to partake in or not as they choose is to share with us any accessibility needs they may have. And I'm someone with terrible chronic pain. Emma knows all about it. I'm someone that had a ketamine infusion 2 weeks ago. So sometimes as a facilitator, what I like to do to create an atmosphere where people feel comfortable bringing forward their accessibility need is that I state my accessibility need, even if I don't really think it's so important for me today. Just by giving that example as a facilitator and saying, I'm a pain person, so I'm going to fidget, I might need to get up, I might be taking medication or something during the session. Just by putting it out there, I'm kind of normalizing that. And I've found in my experience that that's really helpful in creating an atmosphere where people feel comfortable to put their hand up and say if that's something they need. I don't personally know how closed captioning works in Zoom, which is a shame. But I've been with co-facilitators that have successfully set that up before. And yeah, there's a culture in the groups that if you need something to make, if others can do something for you that can make it more comfortable and accessible for you, then, you know, as a group, we try to do that. And we also, you know, try to make it as comfortable as possible for people to come forward.
I was just starting to answer that. I'm not a very fast typer. So I was just starting to answer the question about funding there, Scarlett. And I'm also aware of time because we've kind of gone over that. Yeah, so it's different everywhere, and so it might be just that one organisation says, yeah, we're going to sponsor a group, and so then they can do that, and they might just make an arrangement with the facilitators to do that. I know in South Australia at the moment they have a project that's funded by SA Health, and ours was funded by New South Wales Health, which is what really got us going. So it was fantastic to have that initial funding to really set things up. I think it made a huge, and to fund the research and to really be able to do things that will help us to be sustaining. And yeah, so in WA it's different again. Sometimes they've done it through grants and so on. So we're always kind of on the lookout for ways we can just fund alternatives to suicide. And I think there is that factor that Scarlett mentioned of just really kind of being mindful about where funding comes from, and you know, it can be complex, I guess, because, you know, of the particular approach means that, I guess, in the past, people have been worried about the kind of concerns around risk, but I think the landscape is changing quite significantly around thinking about risk across services, including government services. So.
Yeah, I would just kind of, to give a specific example of what you're saying, Kath, you know, we welcome funding from anybody who wants to fund Alt2Su groups to happen. However, there are some things that are part of those Alt2Su values that we want to ensure that we sustain. So, for example, we don't want to hold Alt2Su groups in a clinical space.
No.
We don't want there to be any kind of diagnostic gatekeeping, or we don't want there to have to be, you know, everybody has to fill out a K10 before they can join, or anything like that. So sometimes, through no fault of the people that are excited about helping us start some Alt2Su groups, the funding is attached to some conditions like that. And sometimes it's a matter of negotiating it, and other times it might not be appropriate for upholding the values of Alt2Su.
Yeah. And so we always come back to the charter, right? So that becomes part of any kind of process we're involved in terms of funding or grants, is that the charter is part of our, you know, this is what this is about, so that people know exactly what they are funding from the beginning.
Wow. Well, I'd really like to thank the three of you, Scarlett, Emma and Catherine, and also Gillian for her introduction to this space, but especially to through describing to us the Alt2Su movement program groups. And, you know, it's just fascinating to hear about the value of that peer connection that you see you're describing in these groups. So I'd really, really like to say thanks, and I invite everybody else to also acknowledge via reactions or clapping hands or in the chat, however you like to do it. I'd just like to share, I hope I can share a little bit better this time, my screen. I'd just be really interested in getting some feedback from participants. So if you can either, I'll send out the link in the email with the link to this recording, or use the QR code, because it really helps us to be planning future events. And yeah, hopefully we'll see everybody online reasonably soon again. So I just, yeah, thank you so much to everyone, and for you four for presenting. So thanks very much, and bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for volunteering your time to do this. Much appreciated.
Many thanks all, particularly to the inside and out people. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.